August 26, 1346. On a rain-soaked field near the village of Crécy in France, 9,000 exhausted English soldiers braced themselves against more than 30,000 of Europe's most elite knights. The French seemed unbeatable, superior in numbers, armed with heavy cavalry, and boasting the proudest nobility in Christendom. Their confidence was so absolute that high-born lords argued over who would earn the glory of killing the English king. 4 hours later, 1,500 nobles lay dead, princes, dukes, counts, even kings, while the English lost barely 40 men. In a single afternoon, 5 centuries of armored supremacy collapsed, undone by commoners wielding bent wood and string. The blind King John of Bohemia rode willingly into death, refusing to let honor pass him by. French knights trampled their own men as they panicked, and the Genoese crossbowmen hired to help them were slaughtered by the very nobles who commanded them. For weeks afterward, crows were so engorged with noble flesh they could hardly fly. This was the Battle of Crécy, the day medieval warfare died in the mud, and the idea of noble superiority shattered under a storm of arrows. Edward III had invaded Normandy with around 15,000 men, asserting his claim to the French throne. His army carved a path of destruction through northern France in a chevauchée, a campaign of plunder meant to show that the French king could not protect his own people. After sacking Caen, the English headed toward the port of Calais when the French finally cornered them. King Philip VI had assembled the mightiest host in Europe, over 30,000 men, including 12,000 armored knights and mounted men-at-arms. Nearly every major noble house in France was present, along with allies from across the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. It was Europe's nobility concentrated into one glittering, overconfident hammer. The French knight was the tank of his age, a mounted warrior in full armor, raised from childhood to fight, his equipment costing more than a village earned in years. For centuries, the cavalry charge was the decisive force of war. Infantry were obstacles, archers, inconveniences. But Edward III knew something the French refused to understand. The future belonged to his 5,000 longbowmen. These English and Welsh archers, often peasants or hardened criminals, were required by law to practice every Sunday. The longbow was simple yet deadly, a 6-foot stave of yew that could send arrows 250 yards and with enough force to pierce armor at close range. Archaeologists can still identify longbowmen by their deformed left arms, stretched and twisted by years of practice. Edward positioned his army on a slope, forcing the French to charge uphill. He placed archers in a V-shaped formation for overlapping fire, and then issued a revolutionary order. His knights would dismount and fight on foot. English nobles standing shoulder to shoulder with peasant bowmen shocked everyone. But Edward understood that mounted heroics would only get his army killed. That night the English calmly prepared. Archers waxed bowstrings. Stakes were driven into the ground. Pits and trenches were dug by torchlight. Meanwhile the French arrived starving, exhausted, disorderly, and arrogant. Nobles bickered over who would lead the attack and who would claim Edward III as a prize. Their king struggled to impose discipline over a mob more interested in glory than strategy. By late afternoon, as thunderclouds rolled in, a sudden downpour drenched the field. English archers unstrung their bows to protect their strings. The Genoese crossbowmen, elite mercenaries, could not do the same. Their bowstrings sagged and their heavy shields were stuck with the baggage train. When Philip VI finally commanded his men to wait for morning, the nobles ignored him and surged forward anyway. The battle began not through strategy but through pride. The Genoese marched forward and launched a weak, rain-ruined volley that fell short. Then the English replied. 5,000 longbows fired in unison. Witnesses describe the sound as thunder as 60,000 arrows fell every minute. Within moments, the Genoese broke, turning to flee, only for French nobles to charge through them, cutting them down for cowardice. The mercenaries died between English arrows and French lances. With no one left in front of them, 12,000 French knights charged uphill into the storm. Arrows struck horses in their eyes, throats, joints, anywhere armor couldn't reach. A horse hit with multiple arrows collapsed instantly, creating piles of flesh and metal that halted the charge. Knights behind slammed into the fallen. Mud sucked at hooves and boots. Hidden pits snapped legs. Sharpened stakes impaled horses mid-stride. At close range, bodkin-tipped arrows pierced visors, joints, and mail. The impacts rattled armored men like stones in a drum. Still the French charged, 16 times. Each wave broke upon the English line like surf against stone. When archers ran low on arrows, they sprinted out into the carnage, pulled shafts from dead and dying Frenchmen and fired them back. Then came the most tragic moment of the battle, the blind King John of Bohemia. Blind for years but unwilling to abandon honor, he ordered his knights to tie their reins together so they could guide him forward. He charged directly into the English lines, striking at shadows, and was cut down. When discovered, he was still tied to his loyal companions. Moved by his bravery, Edward's son, the Black Prince, adopted his emblem of 3 ostrich feathers still used by the Prince of Wales today. As the slaughter continued, panic and rage replaced discipline. Nobles fought each other for the front, desperate for glory before death claimed them. King Philip himself was unhorsed and wounded through the jaw. His sacred battle banner, the oriflamme, was abandoned in the mud. By dawn, the scale of the massacre was undeniable. The flower of French aristocracy lay dead. Over 1,500 nobles, 11 princes, and thousands of knights and men-at-arms. The English lost around 40 men. Medieval chroniclers called it an act of God. In truth, it was mathematics, discipline, and preparation. Crécy shattered the old world. Ransom culture, where nobles captured each other for money, died that day. English archers killed without hesitation or respect for rank. The psychological shock to Europe's nobility was immense. A peasant with a bow could kill a lord just as easily as another knight could. Entire provinces lost their leaders. Administration collapsed. France scrambled to rebuild its army, copying English tactics it had once mocked. But even then, they failed to learn quickly. 10 years later at Poitiers, they repeated the same mistakes with identical, disastrous results. Crécy marked the moment when warfare shifted from heroic charges to ranged fire, discipline, and defensive planning, laying the foundation for modern combat. Ironically, the longbow itself would later be replaced by gunpowder weapons that required almost no training to use. The weapon that destroyed chivalry was itself doomed by progress. Today, a small monument marks the field of Crécy, but few visitors realize that on that muddy slope, an entire world ended. 5 centuries of knightly dominance were swept away by peasants who practiced archery every Sunday. The English didn't just win a battle. They proved that courage cannot defeat physics, that noble blood cannot stop arrows, and that the age of the knight was over forever. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most brutal turning points, like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from.